TikTok Tourette's. In 2020, neurologists across 3 countries started noticing teenagers showing up with the exact same tics, the same odd twitches, the same specific vocalizations, and none of them had ever met. The uniformity was the first red flag. Tics are neurological and individual. They vary from person to person, tend to be subtle, and don't typically include coprolalia, the involuntary swearing most people associate with the condition. Coprolalia affects fewer than 15% of people with Tourette's. On TikTok, it was practically a prerequisite. The symptoms spreading weren't just similar, they were copies. What clinicians identified was mass sociogenic illness, a documented phenomenon where social and psychological factors produce genuine physical symptoms in clusters of people who share an environment. The environment here was an app. Teenagers, many already under significant stress, were watching hours of content on tics, and their nervous systems borrowed the template. The symptoms weren't all invented or always performed consciously. They were real. They just weren't Tourette's. The mechanism is your mirror neuron system. When you watch someone repeat a movement, your motor cortex activates as though you're executing it yourself. Add social reinforcement, comments, community, and a sense of belonging. And a stressed brain doesn't just observe the behavior, it absorbs it. The tics spread because attention and repetition are enough to train a nervous system into a pattern it never had before, which should honestly make you think twice about what you've been watching lately. Dissociative identity disorder. Somewhere along the way, one of the rarest psychiatric diagnoses in the world became more prevalent than the common cold. DID, or dissociative identity disorder, is a severe trauma response in which a person develops distinct identities capable of taking control of their behavior, often with amnesia between them. Estimates place it at 1 to 3% of the population, concentrated heavily among survivors of extreme early childhood abuse. On TikTok, it became a content format. Creators introduced their alters by name, pronoun, and personality. Some built out entire backstories. The disorder that clinicians describe as extremely distressing and functionally devastating got reformatted as something closer to a found family drama with a rotating cast. The appeal isn't hard to understand. A lot of people feel like different versions of themselves at work versus home, around family versus friends, and in crisis versus calm. DID content gave that ordinary experience a clinical frame and an audience. If you feel like a different person depending on context, maybe that's not just a normal human experience. Maybe it's a diagnosis. What gets lost in that translation is what DID actually costs the people who have it. The amnesia isn't a dramatic blackout scene. It's losing hours, relationships, and continuity in ways that make basic daily functioning genuinely difficult. The identity states aren't characters you manage. They're a fracture in the experience of being one person, produced by abuse severe enough to split self-continuity during development. Giving that experience a TikTok format doesn't just misrepresent it, it makes the real version harder to recognize and take seriously. ADHD. If you've ever zoned out during a lecture, gotten distracted by a fly buzzing around, or couldn't sit still for more than 5 seconds without bouncing your knee up and down, congratulations! TikTok has just given you a formal diagnosis. ADHD content on TikTok is engineered around recognition. The format is almost always a list of relatable behaviors delivered fast, with the implicit message that identifying with them means something medical. Forgetting why you walked into a room, starting tasks and abandoning them, becoming so hyper-focused on a video game that you lose track of time. Every item is built to produce a, "wait, that's me" reaction, and it works, because most of those behaviors are genuinely common. ADHD, or Attention Deficit Hyperactivity Disorder, is a neurodevelopmental condition, meaning it's present from early childhood and affects how the brain generates and regulates attention systems. The diagnostic threshold isn't whether you experience distraction. Everyone does. It's whether the pattern is persistent across multiple settings, present since childhood, and severe enough to cause measurable impairment in school, work, relationships, or your ability to manage basic daily responsibilities. Clinicians call this the impairment criterion, and it's the part that TikTok conveniently leaves out. Getting bored in a meeting is not impairment. Losing 3 jobs because you cannot complete tasks regardless of how much you want to is. Once you understand that distinction, you realize most of what circulates online isn't describing a disorder, it's describing being a person with a phone. Autism. There's a specific feeling you get when someone online describes your entire inner life in a 45-second video, and it turns out that feeling is not the same thing as a diagnosis. Autism spectrum disorder, or ASD, is a developmental condition affecting social communication, sensory processing, and behavioral patterns from early in life. The diagnostic profile is very specific: persistent differences in how you read and respond to social cues, restricted or repetitive behaviors, sensory sensitivities that cause genuine impairment, all present since childhood. When the profile fits, it explains things about your experience that nothing else has ever adequately covered. What TikTok built was a much wider net: feeling overstimulated in loud environments, preferring text to phone calls, struggling with small talk, and the feeling of being odd or different. These appear in autism, but they also appear in introversion, social anxiety, sensory processing differences, and ordinary human variation. The platform blurred the distinction between having autistic traits and being autistic, and then handed the name and identity to anyone who recognized themselves in the description. The people making the content often are truly autistic and sharing their genuine experience. That part is real. What happened downstream is that the emotional force of finally feeling understood became indistinguishable from the clinical accuracy of the diagnosis. Recognition is powerful. It's also not a screening tool. Schizophrenia. The word psychosis now gets used to describe everything from a bad panic attack to staying up too late diving down rabbit holes, which is a problem because psychosis is actually a devastating disorder to have. Psychosis is a specific state in which a person loses contact with reality. They experience hallucinations that feel completely real, hold delusions they're convinced are true despite contradicting evidence, or both. Schizophrenia is the condition where these episodes occur chronically, often alongside severely disorganized thinking and significant deterioration in daily function. It is not a metaphor, a mood, or a way of describing a bad week. The problem is, the terms are used too loosely. People use paranoia to describe believing their phone is listening to them, delusion to describe being convinced someone is interested in them romantically when they're just being polite, hallucination to describe seeing a face in a crowd that isn't there, or that split second where you think you see something that vanishes when you look directly at it. None of these are clinical uses, they're casual ones, and each time the word gets borrowed to describe ordinary distress, it loses a little more of its clinical weight. Schizophrenia is a chronic condition. People with it don't have one bad episode and recover. They manage recurring breaks from reality, often for the rest of their lives, with medication that helps, but never really restores full baseline function. Most can't hold jobs. Most lose relationships. Many end up homeless. When psychosis gets used casually to describe an anxious spiral, the word loses the weight it needs to carry for the people living with the actual condition. Depression. TikTok didn't just spread misinformation about depression. It made depression look desirable. The content follows a consistent template: low lighting, melancholy audio, captions about emptiness and exhaustion framed as emotional depth. The comments validate the performance rather than suggesting the person might need help. The videos perform well because sadness, presented aesthetically, reads as sensitivity, as insight, as something worth aspiring to, which is a strange thing to build around a disorder that, at clinical severity, removes the ability to feel much of anything at all. Major depressive disorder involves anhedonia, the inability to experience pleasure in things you normally love, persisting for weeks. You sleep 12 hours and wake up more exhausted than before. Thinking feels like moving through wet concrete. Appetite vanishes or spirals into constant eating. There's a physical heaviness, a numbness so profound that you'd almost prefer sadness because at least sadness is something. Major depressive disorder doesn't make life feel cinematic and sad. It makes it feel flat, draining, and gray in a way that doesn't photograph well. Burnout, grief, and loneliness are real and worth taking seriously on their own terms, but dressing them in depression's clinical language doesn't serve the people experiencing them. It just borrows the weight of a more severe diagnosis to make ordinary suffering feel more valid. The people for whom depression is genuinely debilitating don't get a moody filter. They get months of their life they can barely account for. Objectophilia. There is a difference between naming your car, feeling emotionally attached to your phone, and claiming you're in a romantic relationship with a tree. But online, all three now live in the same category. Objectophilia refers to sexual or romantic attraction to inanimate objects. It's documented, it's rare, and for the people who experience it, it's a consistent and often primary orientation rather than a passing affinity. The objects involved aren't stand-ins for human connection. They're the actual focus of attraction, which is what separates the clinical phenomenon from the TikTok version. What the platform has done has lumped several entirely different things into one pile. Anthropomorphizing objects, giving your car a name, talking to your plants, treating your phone like a companion, is a normal human cognitive tendency. Emotional attachment to possessions is common. Feeling genuine grief when something meaningful breaks is not unusual. None of this is objectophilia. It's how people relate to objects they depend on or care about, and it has always existed, long before there was a label available to claim. The issue is that TikTok rewards escalation. Casual attachment gets engagement. Romantic attachment gets a whole lot more. Add a community of people adopting the same language, and you've created a category where ordinary affection and a genuine paraphilia share a name without sharing anything else. Bipolar disorder. People now use bipolar to describe waking up grouchy, snapping at their roommate, then laughing with friends by dinner. Actual bipolar disorder is something entirely different. The casual version treats the diagnosis as synonymous with moodiness, the idea that having more than one emotion in a given day means something is clinically wrong. This framing matters because what actually separates bipolar disorder from ordinary mood variation is scale, not the fact that moods change. The magnitude, duration, and fallout of the episodes involved. A manic episode lasts a minimum of 7 days. During that stretch, you might go without sleep for several nights and feel energized rather than tired. You might spend your rent in an afternoon, make irreversible decisions with total confidence, speak so rapidly that people around you struggle to follow. Judgment doesn't just slip, it completely disintegrates. The elevated state feels justified from the inside, which is part of what makes it dangerous. Between the manic highs come depressive lows, the kind of functional deterioration described earlier, sometimes even more severe. Bipolar disorder requires specific clinical management, often including mood stabilizers and years of therapy. Mislabeling ordinary irritability or emotional variability as bipolar doesn't just misrepresent the condition, it makes it easier to miss in people who actually have it, because the words become almost meaningless. OCD. OCD has become the diagnosis everyone thinks would be cool to have until they actually understand what it means. Claiming it has become a way of signaling that you're organized, precise, detail-oriented, and particular about your environment. "I'm so OCD about my desk" is not a confession, it's a brag. But OCD has nothing to do with organization or neatness. It never did. Obsessive-compulsive disorder is driven by intrusive thoughts, unwanted, often disturbing mental intrusions that generate severe anxiety and won't respond to logic. They're not just preferences or pet peeves, but recurring fears about harming someone you love, being convinced you've done something terrible, or violent and sexual thoughts that contradict everything you actually value. They don't reflect reality, but that knowledge changes nothing about the anxiety they produce. Compulsions are what follow, behaviors performed to temporarily reduce that anxiety. Checking, counting, repeating, seeking reassurance, running mental rituals. The relief is brief, the anxiety returns, and the cycle repeats itself. People with severe OCD can spend hours a day trapped in that loop, fully aware it's irrational, completely unable to exit through reasoning or willpower. The disorder isn't about high standards, it's about being held captive by your own mind. The internet didn't invent these diagnoses, it just made them difficult to distinguish from the real thing. When the fake and genuine sound identical, the people who actually need help don't get taken seriously because nobody can tell the difference anymore.